I'm happy to be with all of you today to share some insights about the architecture of this place. And over the past several years, I wrote a book about Utah's architecture. It's a guidebook that you might take with you on drives or hikes or walks throughout the region. And the book describes more than 600 built places in this magnificent state, from ancient times to 50 years ago, what the National Trust describes as the historic time period. And I can't even tell you how much fun it has been to do this. And some of my happiest times were those weekends when I drove in my car, oftentimes all by myself, through the rural and urban landscapes of Utah. There were times when I came upon a new building like the ZCMI Cooperative in Glendale or the Rock Schoolhouse in Elsinore, Utah. When I laughed out loud, I was so delighted and happy to have found such wonderful evidence of the times and lives of those who lived in the past. There are many ways to organize the buildings I experienced, by type, by function, by material. But what I'd like to do tonight is to talk about some of the themes, not so much individual buildings that I've seen in the state's architecture, some of the distinctive cultural landscapes, the individual homestead, the rural village, the mining town, or the hierarchy of buildings the Latter-day Saints built as they practiced their religion, the components of the genteel town, or what I would call living the good life, like schools and theaters or parks. For me, there's nothing like a great building. Buildings evoke a sense of the human experience. They are living, breathing voices of the past and hold clues to what we most hope for in life. A state's architecture is a dynamic documentary of values and history of real lives that played out in a physical world. For a painter like Utah's LeConte Stewart, buildings contributed to the spirit of a place and were key elements in a landscape. And unlike the proverbial geography of nowhere, of franchise buildings and anonymous architecture that can be found anywhere rather than a particular place, the buildings Stewart studied in rural landscapes bring stones and sky, building technologies, and cultural expectations into a uniquely Utah blend. They are of this place. For decades, Stewart planted himself in agricultural fields at the base of the foothills running along the eastern edge of Davis County. And from there, the seasons ran across the hills like clouds blocking the sun and changed the land beneath them. Like the Rouen Cathedral series that Monet did, Stewart studied the effect of lighting, color, and texture on form and indelibly printed the foothills of Davis County on our collective consciousness. But it's also true that Stewart's paintings, as true for many Utah landscape painters, inspire a sense of the built past, the small rural homestead that formed the focal point of countless paintings, suggesting life we remember, a collective identity spelled out in wooden barns, zigzag fences, and adobe buildings. Places carve out identities for us as individuals, but also as members of communities with shared histories and present lives. So, where do we begin? If we think of built landscapes instead of single buildings, we start with the big picture or the larger frame. And as we dig in and begin to search for a sense of this place, the context or the spatial context of Utah's buildings, we need to commit to real effort. We need to get to the absolutely perfect place. Although it's not the only important place, Salt Lake City is the starting point, a sort of center point, not all that different from the town square at the center of most Utah towns and cities. The mountains that border the line of settlements that make their way through Utah from north to south provide countless opportunities to see from above what we have built below. One of the very best views of downtown Salt Lake City is from the top of Ensign Peak, just north of the state capitol. A short and not too difficult hike. It provides the best vantage point on the grid of streets that stretches out in every direction from the city center. And there you see the commercial center where stores and office buildings blend into industrial zones, and light industries into residential areas of houses or apartment buildings. You can also feel the expensive value, the way it sweeps from side to side, and the way the mountains form an edge, but also the ever present backdrop, the principal figure on this landscape. You cannot understand Utah's built environment without getting a handle on the mountains. They sustain settlement with water from streams running down their slopes, with stone quarried in their canyons and timber cut from their forests. Distant in view is the Great Salt Lake, appearing to be more mirage than reality, and the sublime stretch of islands that rise out of the lake, the changing hues of earth and sky and water, again speak to relationships or systems or patterns on the landscape. Towns were placed strategically on the land. These central places tended to be located at predictable distance from each other. The same 35-mile pattern established early on by Brigham Young held constant. These towns interacted in a complicated system of exchange. If asked for my favorite list of buildings in Utah, I wouldn't hesitate with a few. The Pine Valley Meeting House, for example, the Spring City Tabernacle, the Cathedral of the Madeleine, Ogden's Piri Egyptian Theater. But many of them would be names you don't recognize. I'm very biased towards the vernacular or most commonplace. I find the simple Pioneer Hall parlor house to be a poignant statement about faith and courage, of sacrifice and endurance. And I love them in adobe or stone, it doesn't matter. The best way to experience these buildings is to walk inside and close the door behind you, to be patient and quiet, to experience them. Touch the adobe or plaster covered wall. And I wish I could say drag your tongue across its surface, but you might think I was nuts. But be sure to smell it. It will remind you that it came from the earth, that the line between that building and the natural world that gave birth to it is fine. Its relationship is direct and tangible. And the best way to understand our cities and towns, our buildings, is to experience them, to walk around them and through them and take time to hear what they're saying. And if you're like me and you sincerely want to experience this place, it helps if you get out of your car and stop and talk to people who are standing in their front yards or in front of their store and ask them to tell you the names of things and how they fit together in a community. Ask for stories and what they remember about the history of storms and the age of trees. Who kept their house up and who didn't? You can get from them the real sense of a place, the authentic geography, and take some measure of the love of it. There's no way around it. If you want to understand, you must take the time. An understanding of a city or a place requires attention to structure, to character, and to meaning, and how all of these function in a system that orients visitors or inhabitants to its place. The early temples of the Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake, St. George, Manti, and Logan, the Kol Ami or B'nai Israel synagogues, or the Cathedral of the Madeleine functioned as pieces in a system of orientation. The concept of cultural landscapes helps us think in holistic ways about the space that human beings conceptualize, build, and inhabit. A cultural landscape is more than a collection of buildings and other built structures, but also includes farm fields where humans work, parks where we play, and streets where we move between different places. Cultural landscape is about relationships between each other and the way they interact with the land. It's a collection of ideas and artifacts, as well as people and natural formations. In Utah's built landscapes, men and women constructed buildings with rocks and timber harvested from the land and rooted their homes, places of worship, schools, and institutions in a particular geography that challenged them, nurtured them, and distinguished their efforts in placemaking. We could easily exaggerate the effect of the social and religious homogeneity of the territory. Instead, there was considerable variation in buildings themselves and in the arrangement of private residence on town lots. The prevailing individual unit of settlement was the homestead. In towns, houses were located on lots large enough for outbuildings. and included smokehouses and barns and outhouses and granaries and small orchards and always a household garden. And although configuration varied, the basic components were the same. They became the domain of the woman who managed production of food for the family and the maintenance of the home. There are hints in Utah's buildings of the origins of its first white settlers who came as a group. In what we call Utah's vernacular architecture, or architecture built by common folk with native materials and with little pretense for style, it had its roots in the East Coast or in Europe where they had been before. But in Utah, the simple forms of rectangular houses with floor plans shaped like I's or H's or T's were built broadside to the street with moderately pitched gabled roofs, doors found at the center, and simple decor, faintly influenced by a classical consciousness. A rudimentary awareness of the golden mean expressed an awareness of the appropriate relationship between squares and rectangles. It ordered placement of windows and doors. Built of log, adobe, kiln-dried bricks, or stone in this example, these house types were repeated hundreds of times throughout the territory that extended north to Idaho and west to Nevada and as far south as San Bernardino, California. When the short end of the rectangle faced the street, it was almost always a public building, a church, a schoolhouse, a cooperative, or even a city hall. Colonization proceeded quickly after 1847 along the lines drawn by the mountain range to the east and north, and Brigham Young deployed groups of settlers from Salt Lake to claim the region using this template, the plat of the city of Zion, to construct more than 450 towns throughout the region. It was often necessary to erect temporary shelters while more permanent buildings were under construction. Perhaps the most characteristic element of Mormon colonization was its group orientation. Individual fur trappers and explorers first had identified the area as prime and fertile ground for settlement, but when the Mormons came into the area, they came in groups. Essentially well-rounded, stratified, in some sense self-sufficient communities emerged within a few years. Solidified by their common goals, groups of Mormon settlers created communities dedicated to the prospect of creating orderly, stable, and thriving towns. From the start, Salt Lake City was the center place from which the church president directed the colonization of a region and a model city, a prototype repeated hundreds of times throughout the region. As a model, it embodied religious ideas in tangible physical terms. Salt Lake City was an intentional center place, the metaphorical nexus of literal ideas about the centrality of religion in the lives of its first settlers. The strict cardinality or orientation north-south, east-west was mapped and extended throughout the entire region in a movement in every direction from the sacred to the profane, and endowing space in the process with new meaning and connection to this essential core idea. Distinctive doctrines such as consecration or cooperation wove a web, a city that mapped ideas about community and space. Variations can be attributed, of course, to ethnicity, but also to natural resources, building skills of the early settlers, which you can imagine varied dramatically, geographical location, economics, and ethnicity. Most men had at least some basic knowledge of how to build a house, and this can be seen in a range of vernacular structures from houses to outbuildings, all constructed without written plans, using traditional skills and knowledge. Cottonwood trees lined creeks throughout the state and provided a ready source of wood for log construction in the area, which is usually the first wave of construction. Not as straight or as long as the wood of coniferous trees, cottonwood was readily available for log buildings, and the step in the process of filling in the spaces between the logs was time-consuming and very difficult, so the straighter the log, the better. Top and bottom log edges were not hewn or cut regularly in the first generation of log buildings. So chinking, this process of filling in the spaces, was really critical in creating tight, weatherproof interiors. And log buildings found in Utah display the most common types of notching, or the way the corners are connected, found in the United States more broadly. The log buildings that have weathered well were usually the half or full dovetail notch, although barns and other outbuildings sometimes had saddle notches that were simpler to construct. One of the most unusual features of pioneer architecture is the frequent and original use of adobe for bricks. And although our pioneer adobe structures did not resemble the pueblos of the Southwest in its use, in Utah, adobe was molded into standard size kiln dried brick molds. Adobe played a prominent and key role in the physical growth of the territory during the first 4 decades of settlement. Driven by the scarcity of wood for building, the Mormon settlers adapted adobe to their own particular needs. And when they used adobe bricks, they built traditional gable roofed houses, rectangular structures, not unlike those built of frame or bricks in other parts of the country. The unusual use of adobe by the Latter-day Saints was often the cause of comment by outside visitors to this place. Outsiders seeing the Mormon community for the first time noted this combination of the familiar and the exotic, and some of the most interesting descriptions of 19th century Utah are travel accounts by visitors passing through the area. Maybe the most colorful writer and explorer to pass through the region was Sir Richard Burton, who visited Utah Territory in 1860. Burton saw the similarity between what he called thick, sun-dried adobe in Utah with materials, quote, common to all parts of the Eastern world, so much so that at a distance, the aspect was somewhat oriental, unquote. Pioneer builders noted the technique for producing adobe bricks in their journals upon occasion, and most had firsthand experience in the production of adobe bricks. Nearly everyone in the community, including women and children, joined in what must have felt like a community dance, raising their skirts precariously high as they stomped in the wet clay and straw and helped mold bricks into handmade molds, or carried and laid the wet clay and straw, laying the mud bricks to bake in the sun or be placed in the walls. Adobe was used for homes, but also for barns and granaries and chicken coops and sheds and other outbuildings. And adobe houses were built for members of all social classes, and adobe was used indiscriminately by each of the different ethnic groups. The size and quality of adobe bricks varied according to region. Different qualities of soil, humidity, and experience impacted the success of the venture. In Parowan, for instance, adobe bricks were a reddish brown color and measured 10 by 5 by 3. And in St. George, the bricks were a yellow buff color and measured 12 by 6 by 4. The best adobes were made from loam or clay loam soil. Soil with too high a clay content caused the bricks to shrink or crack while drying, and too high a sand content caused them to crumble and fail to bond properly. And this is an example of brick house, and you can see the similarity between the ending result. Because it wasn't as strong a building material as wood or brick, the walls of an adobe house had to be very thick, usually 3 bricks thick. But because of that, the walls produced a well-insulated interior, warm in the winter and cool in summer. Adobe walls were resistant to fire, and another advantage of wood building was it was readily available. The natural deterioration was reduced with a cover of stucco or plaster. Many adobe houses actually had decorated veneered exteriors, asphalt shingles, for example, nailed up that were scored to look like stones or bricks. Regional variety in building and technology was nowhere better in evidence than in the beautiful vernacular stone buildings constructed in Willard, Utah, or in Beaver and Sanpete counties, each having its own indigenous or native material. And while there were several techniques of laying stone walls, the method that was sure evidence of the presence in town of a stonemason was ashlar masonry, or carefully cut masonry. Some of Utah's most beautiful buildings are stone variations on the early settlement standard forms. Despite the difficulty of building with stone, it was very time consuming and required special skills and tools. It was the preferred material for high style public and religious buildings and homes where the owners could afford it. While most men knew certain things about building a house or a barn, few knew the craft of stonemasonry, and it was very costly to transport from a quarry and to cut. Unless there was a ready supply of stone nearby, it was more likely that a builder could choose a less complicated solution to constructing his family's house. After the initial stage of settlement, an impressive group of European stonemasons immigrated to Utah with the Mormons, and Scandinavians in Sanpete County used the beautiful cream-colored oolite limestone from nearby Sandpitch Mountains, sometimes with smooth ashlar or cut stone surfaces, which contrasted greatly with those found in Willard to the north. Shadrach Jones, a Welch stonemason in Weber County, built a range of houses from the simple two-story cottage to his own family lived in to the more extravagant homes of wealthy customers nearby. And when brick and lumber became more readily available for construction, stone buildings were far less frequently built. Traces of ethnicity were more rarely and subtly expressed in building techniques and massing. Because of the powerful urge to unify, newcomers from Scandinavia or Great Britain built as those who were already here built sturdy, formal, rationally proportioned houses based on variations of rectangular boxes. But the prevailing message that Brigham Young gave his followers was to build good houses, houses that were metaphors for the kingdom. They were stable, permanent, dignified, and orderly, a mirror of the value system of church members. Good workmanship, the best materials, and practice designed were basic ideals driving most building projects. And wherever they came from, these early settlement builders held deep assumptions about what a building should be. These ideas shaped form. Even the men who billed themselves as architects were usually carpenters first, and they were masons or contractors rather than professionally trained, and certainly only slightly skilled at draftsmanship. As soon as a group of settlers laid out their town plan and distributed lots to families and initiated plowing fields, they joined together to raise a meeting house. Built during the same season as the first houses, meeting houses expressed the community ethic and the cooperative lifestyle of the Mormon people and were built during the first 5 years after settlement. The earliest extant meeting houses were simple rectangular structures undistinguished by reference to style or sophisticated technology. Similar to their domestic counterparts, they were often built of logs, adobe bricks, or some other indigenous material, usually as part of a fort. Limited by available tools brought by the pioneers in their wagons across the plains, these buildings were erected communally and quickly, sometimes in a single day. The first generation of churches served as a location for schools, town or county government meetings, and most social activities like dances or theatricals. They were not exclusively churches. Their multi-purpose nature was perfectly in sync with the broad-based approach to religion taken by the Latter-day Saints. Only a blurred line existed between the temporal and the spiritual, and the meeting house served as the backdrop for both. There was no difference in design or conception between the typical residence and the meeting house from the early settlement period. After the initial attempt at survival, a measure of stability allowed settlers to build irrigation and road systems, saw and grist mills, brickyards, and other local industries and businesses. And in this building phase, pioneer builders attempted to build a higher quality of buildings that were slightly larger and utilized better craftsmanship and a stronger attention to style. That next group of structures included more prominent cornices, impediments, bracketed motifs, pilasters, quoins, and belfries that were added to the basic rectangular form of the building. And this again helped to distinguish them from houses and public buildings. Regardless of where they were in the settlement phase, every Utah town was affected by the coming of the railroad in 1869. The railroad brought into Utah new influences, new people, new technologies, and commercial entities that initiated a process that changed the sacred city into a secular city, more like other Western cities. Although Utah builders would build classical style buildings throughout the first 50 years, the churches that they built in the decades after the railroad finally looked like religious buildings and included engaged central towers, Gothic and stained glass windows, buttresses, and pinnacles, as well as other recognizable Gothic revival elements. Across the board, they created buildings that spoke to a new level of sophistication, community-wide stability, and permanence, and the special character of the building efforts of this particular group. And this is the White Chapel across from the Utah State Capitol. Historically, the tabernacle played a particular role in Mormon communities and religious life. And each ward had its own meeting house, the multi-purpose center of their religious and secular activities. But after the 1830s, members came together for larger meetings in yet another ecclesiastical unit called the stake. Stake meetings were the scene of instruction, where Mormons received advice from their leaders on virtually every topic, ranging from town buildings to family organization. No sacred rituals took place in the Mormon tabernacle. Instead, its sole purpose was for large-scale meetings, and therefore the principal focus was the assembly room that was almost always elaborately decorated. And in many cases, the tabernacle included no other rooms of significance. These buildings were also the scene of some public gatherings, but not the place where parties, dances, or other social activities took place. Tabernacles were built with the most impressive local materials available and had elaborately designed interiors as well. Single access plans, straight line from the front to the back, had some variations in some cases with side wings that would have formed across if you looked at it from above. The most tangible physical evidence of regional hegemony, the tabernacle was also a clear statement that the church was a substantial presence in a particular region. In the hierarchy of Mormon church buildings, the tabernacle held the middle position between the meeting house and the temple. It was a public building. No secret or sacred ceremonies were performed within. It was dignified and formal. Higher type of religious discourse proceeded within its walls. And this is one of the most special ones in the whole state. It's up in Brigham City. In the hierarchy of Mormon buildings, temples have a special place, not public places of worship. They are used by only the most righteous, recommend holding Latter-day Saints. Temples are the backdrop to sacred rituals and ordinances. Performance of the Mormon endowment for the living and the dead, baptisms and sealings, or marriage ceremonies which have significance after death, are performed in separate rooms designed for different purposes. The interior of the temple has a hierarchy of rooms, increasing in importance to the celestial room or the Holy of Holies. Sealing rooms, a baptismal font, which is usually in the basement, which is a pool mounted on the back of sculptural oxen. When temples were built in Utah Territory, their use was restricted to only the most faithful and became therefore sacred interiors that formed a boundary between insiders and outsiders. And furthermore, the interior symbolized the transitional state between this earth and heaven, where the faithful would commune with God. Within months of the completion of the railroad in 1869, Brigham Young began plans for a church-wide economic system that would combat competition from non-Mormon businesses that promised to soon enter the territory. Already bristling from local competition that he thought was draining the resources of his people, Young saw an opportunity to combine their interests into a cooperative merchandising enterprise that would bolster their strength against competition. Young and other business leaders like Horace Eldridge, George Q. Cannon, and others met in the council hall in 1868 to discuss the formation of the Zions Cooperative Mercantile Institution, a Salt Lake-based department store and wholesale entity would supply a series of branches owned and operated by stockholders. As a result, a number of cooperative buildings were built in communities throughout the territory. And besides the meeting house and the tabernacle, local communities built other buildings related to their religious activities that included Relief Society halls and granaries, tithing offices or bishop storehouses, and tithing barns, all important to the building of community and the survival of the pioneers in the harsh environment of the West. This is the Moroni ZCMI cooperative, and on the side, there's still remnants of an original billboard or advertisement for ZCMI all unders or long underwear. This is the little Relief Society building built in St. Clara, Utah. It's so interesting that the Relief Society women from this time period could own property and ran businesses out of these Relief Society halls. And when I showed you an earlier photo of the 19th Ward, the image to the right was a very small little white Relief Society hall in Salt Lake City. This is the Lewiston Tithing Office. It's one of the most beautiful little buildings in Cache County, and it's just so exciting when you come upon it. This is the granary that is also on this site. And in both of these examples, notice the really tight wood construction, series of 2x4s that are tightly linked together and made this really airtight environment for the storage of grain. This is a adobe one down in Teasdale. And these next three images are tithing offices from the early 20th century, and they're based on a series of standard plans, and they're kind of variations on a theme. But they all have this asymmetrical facade and arched opening signifying the entrance. And this is a place where Mormons would donate materials that would be distributed to newcomers or the poor as part of their tithe. This is a wonderful one in Fountain Green. Fountain Green is sort of known for their beautiful brick buildings. They obviously had brick masons that really knew their stuff. And this is the one in Ephraim, on the main street in Ephraim. Okay, I've talked a little bit about the railroad. Let me show you some railroad depots. The style of the Logan Union Pacific Depot is called Railroad Queen Anne. You might be familiar with the Queen Anne style in a Victorian house with the elaborate wraparound porch and towers and all kinds of fancy doodads. On a railroad depot like this, the Queen Anne is expressed through extravagant decor and interesting massing. And you see those different roof pitches that are so awesome. The railroad tracks and railroad stations created an industrial sphere in most cities that was identified by warehouses and loading docks and factories. And the tracks also became a marker between working class neighborhoods, usually to the west, and a growing non-Mormon ethnic population from that on the east side. I look at these as a threshold for immigrants coming to work in Utah mines. This is the second one in Salt Lake City. And this is the one in Ogden. And this is really unusual. It's a mission style, a mission revival. It's very different from the other two, but also they always have these really grand waiting rooms that are kind of like ballrooms. They're so magnificent. Okay, so developing this concept of the gentile city, or a city of culture and proper society, the gentile city demonstrated civility and the desire to create the good society in tangible physical terms. And these first images are images from some outlying towns. This is from Price. Buildings like this make it easy to track the changes from the settlement period to a more stratified and progressive city. Although visible remnants of the utopian dream of the original settlers, things like cooperatives and the tabernacles and that sort of building that were prominent landmarks from the communitarian era, increasingly commercial images and cultural images replaced earlier ones. And Salt Lake City became an environment as much based on capitalism as other cities in the country. And this would be true for other cities throughout the state. Despite the fact that the railroad brought new goods for sale, the impact wasn't necessarily as immediate on building as one might assume. In terms of styles, building technologies, and outward exposure, Utah lagged behind national trends for the next several decades. And in fact, it would be well into the 20th century before the gap narrowed significantly. But regardless, exposure to national events such as the World Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago impacted local building. And Utah men and women attended this fair and exhibited at this fair, including a display of silk produced by the sericulture movement of the Mormon Relief Society. Publications such as builders' guides or books travel and the influx of newcomers with expectations duplicating the worlds they left behind changed both the look and methods of construction. Salt Lake City was not by any means the only city to grow. Ogden and Provo and Logan, this is an example from Gunnison, they built theaters and city halls and other large-scale public projects. Not long after first settlement, Brigham Young felt the Saints needed a grander setting for theatrical performances. He had a group of 10 daughters, they were called the Big Ten, who were pretty much the same age, who loved to perform in these theatrical presentations. So it was really broad-based and enthusiastically embraced. This is a replica of the Salt Lake Theater, which was down south of South Temple. But now it's the home of the DUP. It's at the top of Main Street. When it was completed, the Salt Lake Theater was considered to be one of the most architecturally significant buildings constructed during Young's lifetime. Young encouraged his people to live righteous lives, but also to enjoy themselves. And theater and dance and music became popular escapes from the unending cycle of community building. And other towns imitated this prototype as well. And this is a really great example of that. It's the Opera House in Beaver, Utah. And Beaver has a number of smaller scale buildings or institutions that really imitate those components of the good life that we see in Salt Lake City. So schools and colleges. And we're starting with this really wonderful Petite Neat School, which is up on a bluff overlooking Payson. And it's one of the most interesting sites in the whole state. Some of these buildings, like the Manti Temple I showed you, they're set apart and distinguished by where they were placed on the landscape. And I think that's really an important consideration when you look at these cultural landscapes, trying to get a sense of the way buildings relate to everything around them. This is a 3-story building that's really distinctive in style and massing, and responded to the call for the consolidation of schools, or the bringing together of smaller local schools into larger schools that occurred at the turn of the century. And Richard C. Watkins is the architect of this and most of the other examples I'm going to show you. It's an extraordinarily colorful building. It has a really rich red sandstone foundation, cream-colored brick walls with a hip and gabled roof, main entrances on both the west and the east sides, and 4 classrooms on each side. At the end of the 19th century, when Utah became a state, there was no state-sponsored institution of education in southern Utah. The LDS Church founded the Parowan Stake Academy in Cedar City in 1888 as part of a system of local academies found throughout towns in Utah Territory. And what is today known as Southern Utah University was first established as a branch normal school, became the Branch Agricultural College in 1913, the College of Southern Utah, and then in 1992, a well-respected 4-year university. Old Main is a 3-story brick building with a low pitch hip roof and centrally located octagonal bell tower with a tinted roof. And you can kind of see the way that hangs. The style of the building is called Second Renaissance, and it's reflected by this 3-part division of the exterior, the arched entrance, and the particular use of material. Dixie Academy, the Mazer School, and this wonderful Elsinore White Rocks Schoolhouse that brought me such joy on my drive, and then Brigham Young Academy, which is an earlier building. and then a group of governmental buildings that you'll see throughout the state. First, the council hall and then the territorial capitol in 1852 were early efforts to house the activities of civic government. Regional governmental buildings mirrored the styled structures built in Salt Lake City, only on a much smaller scale. The center of governmental and other public functions was the council house, designed by Truman O. Angell in 1849. This important territorial building was found on the southwest corner of South Temple and Main Street. It was reconstructed, or all the stones were brought up to a site just south of the state capitol and rebuilt. The primary entrance to this two-story, four-square building was on South Temple. Sturdy, unpretentious, formal, this multi-purpose facility provided the physical location for the organizational meetings of Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, the territorial legislature until 1883, when it was destroyed in part by fire, and the upper floor was used by the LDS Church for endowment ceremonies for a number of years before the endowment house was built on Temple Square. The temple was quite, the council hall was quite simple in conception, 45 feet square. The foundation and first stories were of sandstone that was brought down from Red Butte Canyon. And overall, the design is based on square proportions. It has this really significant cornice level at the top of the wall, a low-hipped roof, and a cupola, all fully in line with the Greek Revival style. And the symmetry of the exterior was not continued on the interior, which instead has an asymmetrical arrangement of assembly rooms and other rooms on each floor. In the decades after the railroad, and this is in Beaver, again, remember what I said about Salt Lake City being the prototype and Beaver having these smaller examples duplicating those institutions. This is a wonderful Victorian building. And in Washington County, this is the territorial capital. This is an extraordinary example up in Brigham City. It's well worth driving up there just to see. It's really a beautiful building. And this is an Ogden post office, which also falls in this group of buildings. This wonderful, modest little building out in Eureka. Okay, when the railroad and federal troops came to Utah, they brought with them non-Mormon miners, merchants, and travelers who brought their own religions, attitudes about family and social life, and businesses. And gradually, Utah became more diversified. In 1896, most major religions had established congregations in the state. The churches they built are compelling reminders of the religious diversity that helped enrich this community. Not long after the Latter-day Saints made Utah their home, other churches sent missionaries to the area. Businessmen saw Utah as a market ripe for exploitation, and many came to Utah territory to make a quick profit off Mormon settlers. In 1857, Johnson's army entered the valley, all of whom were non-Mormons, and set up camp 25 miles southwest of Salt Lake City in Cedar Valley. Colonel Patrick E. Connor had brought with him troops who were Catholic and Protestant, and they entered the valley in 1862 along with a huge crowd of camp followers, merchants, artisans, and other workers, again drawn by the potential market in this isolated location in the West. All right, now mining landscapes. Mining landscapes are so incredibly different from the towns based on the plat of the city of Zion with their regular grid formations. Instead, here the streets and buildings cling to the land in patterns quite different from towns elsewhere. The building types are oriented towards service industries. Even boarding houses were intended to serve transient populations. Houses that were added usually were made of frame and felt really transitory or impermanent at the first. This is a really prominent mining town street that you're probably all familiar with, Park City. And here are some of the prominent buildings in Park City. The Park City had significant religious diversity, and it wasn't until the late 19th century that the first Mormon church was built up there. So you have a very different population, very different set of patterns of building on the land. So quite different overall. I threw this one in. It's much later, totally different story, but it's a building you all should track down. And again, it speaks to the religious diversity of the state. So then in the 20th century, I wanted to tell you about a group of libraries that you'll see as you drive throughout the state. For late 19th century Americans, Andrew Carnegie was evidence of the rags to riches ideal. A generous and broad-minded philanthropist, Carnegie funded the construction of 1,650 libraries across the United States because of his belief in the redemptive power of literacy. 23 Carnegie libraries were built in Utah alone. And after meeting the basic criteria, a local community would apply for a grant, and they had to find a building site that they could donate to the project, and they would have to pledge or promise to provide an annual maintenance fee that usually represented about 10% of the original grant. The Carnegie Foundation would provide the rest of the funding to build a local library. Believing that reading was key to what he called moral elevation, Carnegie funded the construction of libraries for small rural American towns who it was really unlikely that they could afford them on their own. Hoping to stimulate local commitment to such projects, he required that towns match the funds he donated. The 1912 Smithfield Public Library is a really great example of the prairie style used for a public building. And like many other Carnegie libraries, it's a one-story brick building with a raised basement and a flat roof, with a strong emphasis on horizontal details. The city acquired 32 paintings by Utah artist Mary Teasdale for the paltry sum of $120. And about 18 to 20 of these paintings are on display at any given moment in the time to this day. Panguitch, really wonderful brick example in Panguitch. Panguitch is known for the quality of their brick buildings, and again, it's worth exploring. And this is a yellow brick building in Beaver. Sanpete County really was good at siting their structures. And this is a public building, and it's built on a gently sloping foothill, creating a sense of monumentality and emphasizing its importance to the community. The Sanpete County Courthouse is an example of the style we call PW modern. If you look at the wall surface, it's very plain. And it has a series of vertical windows, these long, interesting light fixtures. And then at the top of two of the windows on both sides, there's what's called bas-relief sculpture, or really flat sculpture that just adds a little bit of decor. But that abstraction, that simplicity and severity is part of this modern style. So unarguably, one of Utah's most distinctive buildings, the Ogden High School, is considered a masterpiece. Designed under the confines of the Public Works Administration with federal funding, the cornerstone announces it as Public Works Project 1423. Besides putting unemployed Americans to work, the New Deal poured money into the infrastructure projects that we find throughout the state. The Ogden High School makes a powerful horizontal gesture on the landscape. Like most Art Deco buildings, it emphasizes vertical ornament, and that creates this tremendous interest on the wall surface, this interesting tension between the vertical and the horizontal. Bands of metal frame windows, brick pilasters, and the decorative masonry on spandrels in between, with geometric and floral motifs, emphasize this prominent vertical movement. The first decade of the 20th century brought civic improvements to most of these towns. Streetcar lines, transportation improvements would sometimes lead to new suburbs expanding to the periphery of town. They were connected by streetcar systems, eventually by bus routes. Towns spread in virtually every direction. Building Utah during the 20th century was marked by diversity, marrying national trends and styles with a process similar to tape delay. The century began in the Victorian mode. Bungalows and period revival houses followed, and then World War II cottages after World War II. But importantly, in the 30s and 40s, FHA houses, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. They had the effect intended. These loan programs created by the New Deal pumped money into rural Utah, funding the building of roads and schools and public buildings, but also ideas about houses. These programs funded the building of countless numbers of middle-class subdivisions for returning veterans and their young families. And in important ways, they changed the pattern of Utah's physical fabric. Unlike most settlements in the Great Basin, remember the plat of the city of Zion and its grid. Holladay's earliest settlers laid out a plat map showing streets that follow geographical features, creeks or paths, rather than a centralized grid pattern. It grew over time as new settlers acquired plots of land, first along these roads, and in the second half of the 20th century in subdivisions organized by developers. Holladay's earliest settlement pattern was family homes built near adjacent farm fields or orchards. And it was marked by an abundance of land that allowed residents to spread out on the land and grow vegetables and fruits on their property. And over time, they subdivided their acreage repeatedly, even though there are many Holladay lots that are really deep and stretch towards irrigation canals. But flag lots are also a common feature of these areas of the city. Valley View, this street down towards the bottom of this slide, was parallel to Murray Holladay Road and begins on Holladay Boulevard, the two primary roads in this formative period. But Valley View helps give us a sense of the progression of architectural styles that mark change moving eastward from the grand Annie and William Livingston Arts and Crafts House, built in 1917 on the corner of Holladay Boulevard and Valley View, to Wander Lane on the east. With each iteration, the style represents national trends and local preferences. And except for the Livingston House on the corner, they're modest, between 1,000 and 1,700 square feet, but they were designed for family living, built with red brick, wood slats, or brick covered in stucco. And importantly, each includes ample acreage to the rear, reflecting the farm fields of earlier generations. But for me, Valley View gives us the unique opportunity to observe the growth and evolution of Holladay through the first few decades of the 20th century and after the formative period of settlement. Holladay started with a pattern of farmsteads spread out from each other rather than clustered together in the town center. Large agricultural lots became an essential characteristic of Holladay from the first. And until the recent past, what became known as Holladay was unincorporated Salt Lake County, an area where families purchased farm lots and built homes and community. This crosswing tea house is the second oldest house on Valley View, and it's been added on to multiple times over the decades. So just imagine this first part as what's historically significant. Originally, it was 982 square feet large, and it was on a 2.16 acre lot. For the first half of the 20th century, Valley View retained its rural character. A wash house, a woodshed, chicken coop, and root cellar were all on this lot. And they really create this sense of more of a farm environment. But self-sufficiency was a value perpetuated in this way. And the front porch, hip roof, and simple classical details completed the look. This is a historical image of the same. In Utah Territory, as I said before, we had a long tradition of constructing I-homes like those in the Mid-East or East Coast. That simple rectangular house was usually 2 stories tall. But one of the ways to vary that simple plan was to create the crosswing cottage, which was essentially 2 rectangles that met at the center of one of the rectangles. They were built with the same materials, sometimes adobe, sometimes bricks, rarely wood. They had a moderately pitched roof. That triangular pediment at the front reflects the triangular pediment of a Greek temple. And they would have a little entrance porch by the apex of where those two rectangles join. And it was a really popular house type in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And if you look at it, the ornamentation or the decoration is very minor, but it reflects an awareness of the classical styles. This second example, and this is the historic photograph, is an example of really successful program of the New Deal after the Depression. You remember the Federal House Administration, which created a mortgage program to promote homeownership with amortized home loans, and importantly, an agency that studied the ideal home life of a small American family. FHA designed homes imagined perfect home life with a living room you entered when you opened the front door, a dining room to one side, a kitchen sometimes facing the street, two bedrooms and a bathroom to the back of the house. And these houses had no frills, but they really communicate a sense of welcome, order, and solidity. And again, they reflect this sort of science of home living. This example is a period revival cottage, and the earliest part of this house was built in 1899, and almost 50 years later, the second part of the house was added. Both of those brick sections were covered with stucco about the same time. They had two sheds, a chicken coop, a wash house, and a garage on the lot. Originally, it was 2.16 acres and a total of 1,494 square feet. Period revival cottages were almost always modest in size and made of brick. But this one reflects the colonial revival, and I'll show you Tudor revival in just a second. This one is asymmetrical. It reflects on some knowledge of what was part of the Greek revival style. It's covered with stucco, which creates a unified look. This is a historic photo. This is another example of an FHA house. These were perfect for returning vets. And as I said, the FHA designed the way a small four-person family lived in their space and then created these optimized ideal spaces for family living. This is an example of a bungalow, and the bungalow's most prominent feature is the front porch, which opened the house up to the street. And from the porch and entrance, the interior rooms moved from the most public to the most private, sort of procession from the living room to the dining room to the kitchen to the bedrooms at the rear. And typically a bungalow had beautiful wood built-ins, bookcases, fireplaces, columns, and paneling that adorned primarily the public spaces. Natural colors and materials always prevailed. Another example of a period revival house. And I would say two main forces inspired the period revival house. And after World War I, many soldiers returned to America with great familiarity to European styles. Tudor, French Norman, Tudor revival is by far the most common. Perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of a Tudor revival or Gothic revival house is a steeply pitched pediment like you see at the front of this house. Sometimes you'll see half timbering or pieces of stone that are attached to the house to look like it's a deteriorating ancient building. But they create a sense of the exotic, the foreign, and alive, other than what you might have experienced in Holladay, Utah. And the second factor is a familiarity with what was called the picturesque movement of the late 19th century, which was really a reaction against the stark sterility of urban environments and a more nostalgic response to the allure of wildness or the garden. And houses like this sometimes had stained glass windows, leaded glass windows, and I think they project a sense of warmth and permanence, friendliness, and again, this orientation towards family. This is a wonderful example on the top of Valley View and Wander Lane. And again, it's a Tudor revival cottage. In today's climate of tear downs and new builds, it's rare to find a historic landscape as intact as Valley View. Plot maps help us tell the story of growth and change, but I think in-person observation and analysis of these historic properties is the most important thing we can do. Someone built the earliest structures on this block in 1899, and they're still intact and well taken care of, in my mind, really incredibly valuable. Two of them use siding, four of them use brick, but they really present this very strong sense of respect for the historical past. Each house sat on at least an acre. The largest one was 4.4. Importantly, they reflect an awareness of national trends and styles, had rural character, large lots, chicken coops, all of those things. But these houses really aspired to something grand and something interesting and something more. I wanted to include one more example of a really unusual house. And for those of us who grew up in Holladay, we can remember basement houses. And these were really common throughout the 1940s. There probably were a dozen in Holladay. And they were built first before a family could afford to build the rest of the house, and lived in for years before the house up above was built. And the house, I think, represents this, and I think it's why it's called the Hope House, this hope for a grand future. And many times the house that was built above was reflective of the FHA houses, like those that I showed you in just a second, or just a minute ago. So this is like an FHA house. Okay, and finally, there are lots of different ways to view Utah's landscapes through the lens of trails. Lots of people love trail history, of geography, of waves of settlement, and the diversity of persons who stopped here for a while. But I hope that you will notice buildings, the built landscape that surround them, and use them to imagine persons of another time, what they hoped for, and what they hope to make happen in their lives. And this is just a very short list of some of my very favorite drives in Utah. And they include Highway 89. I love the drive between Richfield and Kanab. I think it's one of the most breathtakingly beautiful natural landscapes. But then there's this whole series of tiny little towns like Orderville and Mount Carmel that just have so much for us to look at and imagine. Sanpete County, from the moment you get to the top of 89 and go all the way down to Gunnison, it's just town after town of rich, historic, built landscape. And it's so well preserved. And again, I just think it has this really compelling natural environment surrounding the buildings, and those beautiful like limestone buildings like the Spring City Tabernacle or the cooperative building found in Ephraim. They're really just about as beautiful a building as you can find in the state. I think there's nothing like driving to Cache County from Salt Lake City when you go through Sardine Canyon and the landscape opens up. I mean, I just always sort of suck in my breath. I think it's so beautiful. And then there are all these little towns along the way before you get to Logan, which itself has some of the most remarkable architecture in the state. I really love driving down the western edge of the state and exploring places like Eureka or Mammoth. Some of those long forgotten mining towns have substantial structures and remnants of structures that we can learn from. And Washington County is probably one of the richest architectural parts of our state. St. George just has building after building that are fun to explore, and many of them are open for visitors. But I would encourage you to explore with your eyes wide open, your minds open, and try and imagine these cultural landscapes of people who lived before us. And hopefully this will instill in you a sense of respect and love for the historic past of this place. So thank you very much.